Welcome to the last module of this course, which is on illicit financial flows and resource wealth management. As you can tell, I have a little bit of cold, so if sometimes my voice is a little bit uncomfortable, I will apologize ahead of time. In addition to the IFF and resource wealth management, we will focus on the role of multinational companies and corporations, as it were, tax avoidance and tax evasion and natural resource management in general. And in this discussion, we are also focused on the key role that governments play in the natural resource management or mismanagement. The expert on capital flight and flows in general for Africa is Professor Leonce Dikumana, who is based at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in America. He has a very, very interesting research profile over the last many decades on capital flight from Africa. So if you access the links that I have provided, you will see some of the latest data on capital flight. Actually, he told me that he will have an update of capital flight or the amount of money that Africa is losing through this process by the beginning or end of April. So pretty much soon, he will have a very well updated data set on capital flight on the continent. There is also a very important report that just came out from International Financial Accountability, Transparency, and Integrity, which was launched just 2 months ago. That is under the theme of financial integrity for sustainable development. And the last link you see in the page is in relation to that one, which is a development of the IFF report, which was assembled by the ECA a few years back with stewardship of the former South African President Thabo Mbeki. The outline of the research is highlighted in this page, and I'll directly go into the details. As an introduction, I will just focus on the detrimental or the negative impacts of illicit financial flows. It is a development challenge for Africa, mainly because of the excess volume of resources that we are losing. Over the last 50 years, there were different calculations and computations, and statistical compilers as well as economists have come up with an estimate of the loss, which is in excess of $1 trillion in IFF. Excuse me, just give me a second. My apologies for the interruption. I was saying that there were estimates and there is excess resource that Africa is losing, particularly when you see it as total as well as even annual loss. It is a very, very extensive volume of financial need that we are missing out because of the IFFs. So this loss could have been used to finance infrastructure and also development, social and economic needs of the continent. So Africa needs resources for structural transformation. So all these grand visions and plans or development plans will not come to fruition if we really keep losing funds and vital financial resources in the rate that we are losing them. The illicit financial flows and capital flight problem is facilitated by business or big business, international as well as domestic businesses, and African governments themselves, or politicians who are abusing the power of their public office. So not all politicians or government bodies are responsible for that, but there are some. Politicians and big international companies have been looting the continent for a long period of time, and this is bringing unbearable suffering to the majority of poor Africans. International banks facilitate the transfer of funds and are complicit in the process. For sure, some of the bigger banks, which are located in London, Paris, and Frankfurt, were really conduits of the amount of money that the continent is losing. And it is not also the amount that the continent is losing, but a lot of illicit financial flows globally is moved around by these banks. So countries or developing countries in Latin America and Asia also are losing a lot of money through IFF, even if our focus is here is Africa. The asset recovery process, particularly when I was working on capital flight project with colleagues, I came to know that asset recovery is very, very protracted process legally and also very complex. Therefore, it is better to prevent losing the flows in the first place instead of trying to recoup them back from the places that they were looted and kept away. For instance, we know under Abacha, the Nigerian government has lost billions of dollars. Currently, some of it is being repatriated back to Nigeria, but that is after a protracted legal process of recovery of 20, 30 years. So it is not really easy to recover assets lost once they are lost. Therefore, the prevention of illicit financial flows is what should be focused. Big companies, multinationals avoid paying taxes. So that is another way of really losing a lot of money. And African powerful officials perpetuate the problem of the IFF or capital flight for personal gain. Multinational companies exploit the weaknesses in African institutions in a number of areas, as governments oversight loopholes in national tax policies and challenge of applying the arm's length principle, base erosion and profit shifting. So we will discuss some of the channels through which we lose billions of dollars every year. Led to a loss of billions of dollars. In 2015, they contributed to about 240 billion annual lost revenue or revenue loss for countries around the world in all sectors. But Africa lost more when losses are measured as a percentage of total revenues the continent collects. Contribution of natural resources to government revenue. Africa has rich oil, mineral, and forest resources, but it is not benefiting from all of them as it should due to the controlling behavior of greedy politicians, colluding behavior of greedy politicians and big business. There will not be sustainable development and inclusive growth in the continent if the mismanagement of resources continues at current rates. So Chapter 6, Table 6.1 highlights the grim reality of poor resource revenue collection, particularly from the natural resources sector. The IMF classifies natural resources or the resources that we get through natural resources or the revenues that we mobilize from our natural assets as follows. Receipts collected by government from the natural resources sector through diverse tax and non-tax fiscal instruments. As you can tell, the non-tax element is very, very vital, particularly in the case of natural resource-rich countries. For example, natural resource revenues include common taxes such as corporate income tax, or what we call the capital gain tax, tax on profits of companies, and value-added tax, special taxes on the sector, such as resource rent tax and other quasi-tax and non-tax instruments, such as royalties, profits, and bonuses. So what are the policy challenges in collecting the amount of money countries really deserve from the rich natural resources that they have? One is the proliferation of multiple fiscal instruments, complex fiscal instruments, overlapping, confusing tax policies and regimes, which make revenue collection very difficult. In the process, a leakage happens and Africa loses vital revenue sources that it should command. Some countries use royalties and other estimates of net income of particularly the foreign investors to determine revenue collection and also recoup some parts of it. It's not clear why some countries are abandoning royalties, which are easy to administer and effective to recoup what Africa deserves to the mining and other rights it gives to multinational corporations. Some governments are using corporate income tax to good effect, but others no. But there is also complexity surrounding the determination of the rate that should be applied and the timing of payments by companies. However, income-based taxes such as corporate income tax or capital gains tax are subject to misreporting and underestimation. And when that is the case, even if the rate is high, you will not really get as much revenue as you deserve. The second challenge is the nature of fragmented and uncoordinated institutions in our different African countries. It's not clear who is responsible to regulate the mining sector, the forestry sector, and oil sectors. If you have different ministries to arrange the coordination and also the operation of these sectors, it is very, very complicated. I think in relation to institutions or generally the circumstances in Africa, the proliferation of conflicts also can be a problem. Not only that, the frustration of local communities where you have rich resources or rich natural resources which are not shared with the local community can be a source of some violence and also some conflict with state operators. So in that case, the process of collecting the required amount of revenue from the natural resources sector will be very, very complicated. We know, for instance, some of the potential dangers in the Niger Delta, for instance, in Nigeria. The third policy challenge is poor regulation, lack of coordination among ministries, which relates to the point number 2 that we discussed, is reflected in the lack of clear understanding who regulates what and when. There are examples. For instance, the Ministry of Petroleum or Mining usually leads in the negotiation for exploration, development, and extraction agreements, which can mean that agreements are negotiated, concluded without sufficient participation by the Ministry of Finance or the tax administration. So lack of coordination also is a big policy challenge. Fourth, tax incentives. Research shows that investment in the resource sector in Africa is exploitative. Therefore, providing excessive tax incentive in the run-up to competition to attract a lot of investors is a futile exercise and doesn't attract investment that brings technology spillovers and jobs to the masses. Why? Because investment in the resource sector usually by multinational companies is high-tech and rarely benefit local labor force participation, and it has very limited job opportunities for semi-skilled individuals who can really work in the sector. However, the tax incentive is a key point. Then governments should really avoid the rest to the bottom, meaning if they keep lowering tax rates just to beat their neighboring country for an additional investment from a foreign company, it will not do good to their eventual deserved just or fair share of the proceeds of the natural resources that they give access to. And the fifth policy challenge is related to policy predictability or stability. This particularly in relation to fiscal and tax policies. Investors, businesses, and every economic agent expects tax certainty or policy predictability. So tax certainty and fiscal stability clauses are useful. This should benefit both governments and foreign investors, and they should lead to fair business relationship between them. Tax certainty encourages private investment by enabling potential investors to accurately assess the tax and compliance costs and their obligations, for sure, associated with an investment over its lifetime. Tax certainty is strengthened by fiscal stability clauses in contracts, which are designed to prevent excessive changes to tax code. So the stability, predictability is very, very important. And not only in fiscal policy and tax policy, but in Africa generally, policy approach is usually criticized for its stop and start tendency. So sometimes policies you think are going to be there in place for 5 years, but they may not be there after a year, and so on. So that instability and lack of certainty is not useful. However, fiscal stability clauses may undermine revenue collection since they prevent host governments from renegotiating contracts. So the tax that you want to tax a given investor at the beginning of a negotiation contract, if it is 5%, it cannot really 5% for 20 years. There should be some way of renegotiating contracts, because sometimes maybe the investor who is investing in the natural resource area might get a very, very lucrative find. If they were expecting to extract a few tons of gold, they might get thousands of tons of gold. In that case, you cannot really stick to the original contract agreement, and you cannot say, oh, promise is promise, and I'm not going to change the tax obligations of these corporations. In that case, you fail to renegotiate your contracts, and you fail to generate the proceeds that the country deserves. But this is not as simple as just invoking a renegotiation when market prices change for your natural resources, or the discoveries have become very, very lucrative for the investor, because there are a lot of legal obstacles now for governments to do so. And I will highlight that in the next slide. However, countries should be able to renegotiate existing resource contracts with multinational companies when new information about income and profit streams come to light. But this should be the case if you really put this flexibility from the very beginning of the negotiation of the contract and the signing of the contract. If you want to revise it 10 or 20 years down the line, if that provision is not there, I think the legal battle will start with these powerful, rich multinational companies. For instance, if the price of gold and copper rises, the foreign company benefits, and a fair distribution of that benefit should be recouped by the host economy. Governments have to implement this by front-loading such possible changes while negotiating contract initially, or make provisions for negotiations to take place. So the key word is front-loading. And also another key word is when negotiating contracts initially. So if you don't front-load all these flexibilities, and if you don't really have that in by design within the contract, it is very difficult when markets change or when discoveries are changing to renegotiate the contracts. In the 1970s and 80s, the renegotiation of contracts was much easier. But since then, the legal infrastructure has changed a lot, and the multinational companies are really taking businesses to court, and usually they want to keep government to stick to the original promise that was signed 20, 30 years ago. Here I will highlight one interesting perspective by Carl and Lewis, which was published in February 2021 in Colombian Foreign Direct Investment Perspectives, a very recent work. But Lewis Wells has done some work in the 1970s on the issue of really bargaining between states or governments and multinational companies. And in those days, it was easy or relatively common renegotiating contracts when things change. So they start by this perspective by saying that renegotiation was easier in the past, but no more now. Governments powerful once investors are committed. Yeah, the governments are powerful once the companies come and invest because they put a lot of money, and that is called fixed investment. And once they do that, the balance of power shifts towards government. But before investors come, investors are powerful because governments compete to attract them. So in this process, there is a lot of bargaining with differing powers between these two parties, governments and multinationals. In mineral and other contracts, mistakes, vague terms, failure to account for future conditions and concerns can no longer easily be corrected. So you cannot really easily renegotiate. And when this happens, or when you really try to push the multinationals, they'll take it to court. So arbitration and legal action by foreign investors against governments is very common nowadays. A good example is the perspective mentioned was a case of Venezuela, which is one of the richest countries with oil reserves. And it has some negotiations which were felt to be unfair towards government. Then the Venezuelan government tries to sue the multinationals. And when that was the case, the multinationals took the government to court. And the government also took some extreme measures of nationalizing two of the big multinational company operations within its jurisdiction. So the key message is that renegotiation, very difficult. So front load, and when you initially discuss, please make sure that you build in potential flexibilities that should be allowed for when things change, particularly in relation to oil prices, as Venezuela discovered. It was negotiating when it was $25 per barrel, but the oil prices have fluctuated a lot, much higher than that original amount. And the benefits should really go to local governments as well as to the businesses who are operating in these governments or states. So multinational companies and illicit financial flows. I think here we would like to highlight the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. I'm sure you know the difference very well by now, because tax avoidance is not illegal, and companies exploit these legal loopholes to avoid paying taxes. So the definition is as follows. Tax avoidance generally is used to describe the arrangements of a taxpayer's affairs that is intended to reduce his or her tax liability, and that although the arrangement could be strictly legal, it's usually in contradiction with the intent of the law it purports to follow. So it is a very one proxy of economic injustice that is usually being practiced by multinational companies and many even domestic companies by distorting the tax liabilities that they have. Tax evasion is illegal. This is a process whereby illegal arrangements where liability to tax is hidden or ignored. You are just hiding from local authorities and regulatory authorities which can tax you. And the taxpayer pays less than he or she is legally obligated to pay by hiding income or information from the tax authorities. So putting away the company proceeds in subsidiaries, in tax havens, like Switzerland and the British Virgin Islands, and so on, they just avoid paying taxes on very, very huge amounts of maybe corporate profits. So they just avoid jurisdictions whereby they should be taxed, but they just put their money away in tax havens. And this is an outright illegal activity, and it is called tax evasion. What about illicit financial flows? These are international transfers that are illegally acquired, transferred, or used, as well as aggressive tax avoidance. It is because of this international flows, or undesirable international flows, or illicit financial flows, that Africa is losing billions of dollars every year. Illicit may not necessarily make it illegal, but the harm that pays erosion or shifting profits or profit shifting, aggressive tax avoidance and tax planning due to development justifies considering them as illicit flows because they are morally wrong. Examples of scandal by government officials, for instance, inflating value of procurement contracts and depositing the proceeds in a foreign bank. And this is really a very, very common form of illicit financial flows. So how are they channeled? There are different ways of channeling them. One is aggressive tax planning. You need very good accountants and lawyers. So usually in the discussion of international financial flows or illicit financial flows, it is falling under sophisticated financial engineering operation. So there is a lot of activities behind the scene by accountants to hide the tax obligations of big corporations. So this is done well by lawyers and accountants in the world's famous consulting companies, and multinational companies can afford to rely on their services to limit their tax obligations on their foreign operations. Box 6.1 gives you this aggressive tax planning explanation. Transfer pricing. Multinational companies manipulate the price of goods and services traded between different parts of their multinational group with the aim to shift profits to jurisdictions where corporate tax or corporate income tax or capital gain tax are low and financial secrecy is common. So the tax havens that we mentioned in the earlier slide is very relevant. Therefore, you just put most of your substantial activity or economic activity for it to be registered in a jurisdiction where the taxes are small. So you just distort the price of goods and services, plus also distort where you get most of your income. Another common practice of channeling illicit financial flows is using misinvoicing trade transactions. So natural resources and other commodities that are traded in international commodity markets are susceptible to the intentional manipulation of invoices of goods and services, either from the export side or import side, to disguise their true value and evade taxes and custom duties, and just avoid paying custom duties by declaring less as an export or import. Overvaluing deductible transactions or expenses is a fourth channel through which IFF is channeled. This is basically the opposite of limiting your liability. Here you inflate the liabilities or the deductions, particularly consultancy fees, overhead costs, and other costs are just added up and inflated so that your profit portion is limited. Therefore, the corporation tax associated with that portion of your profit is going to be limited. So another channel for illicit flows is inflating deductible expenses, again through relationships of multinational corporations with affiliates. For example, firms may inflate costs on loans and technical services, which is the consultancy point I made earlier, acquired from related parties, and overstate deductible expenses for equipment and other supplies. And the fifth method of channeling IFF is treaty shopping, and also selling of assets through low tax jurisdictions, again targeting the low tax jurisdictions. Treaty shopping has reduced corporate income tax revenue by about 15% in the African continent, that have signed a treaty with the investment hub, a particular blow to countries with a high dependence on corporate income taxes. Mauritius, for instance, which has received attention recently for facilitating treaty shopping, because it is a low tax jurisdiction, took steps to address this by revising its double taxation agreements with India and South Africa in 2015, which is quite a recent phenomenon. Multinational corporations in the natural resources sector can also avoid tax in resource-rich countries by routing asset sales through low tax jurisdictions. So what can we do to really put an end or reduce IFF? Maybe ending it might be more idealistic than realistic. Therefore, there are initiatives or policy options that can be used by governments in the way to reduce IFF or illicit financial flows from the continent. There are a lot of challenges to stop or reduce IFF. Equally, there are encouraging efforts to combat it. And these are the items that we will discuss. The first one is the OECD Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Package, the BEPS report, which has action points or action plans, 15-point action plans to help governments with the domestic and international tools they need to combat base erosion and profit shifting. But for BEPS to work, we need transparency and data, which are in short supply in Africa and in rich countries that are protecting multinational companies. So it's not only from the side of Africa, but it is also from rich countries, which are the original owners of the multinational companies operating in our continent. So this OECD BEPS initiative has limited value if there is no transparency and data exchange. The second initiative or the second policy option is formulary apportionments and moves away from income-based taxation. Because if you are always relying on the corporate income tax of multinational companies, and if there are aggressive efforts by these multinational companies to undermine or underestimate income, it will not really be helpful to always use income-based taxation as a source of government revenue. So for mobilizing better revenue, we have to move away from always focusing everything on income-based taxation. Excuse me. So understatement of the income is a big problem. Transparency is a huge problem, as we have seen in other contexts when we were discussing lectures in earlier modules of this course. And it is the same when it comes to tax information exchange. Transparency efforts can improve to really limit the inflows that we have in Africa. There is a new global standard for automatic exchange of information for tax purposes. And this was endorsed in 2014. And this is usually if you provide information and share those with another jurisdiction, the other jurisdiction also has a responsibility to reciprocate your efforts. In the light of the failure of reciprocity, this transparency effort may not be useful, or this automatic exchange of information for tax purposes may not work, and usually it fails, mainly because of lack of transparency from both Africa as well as the other jurisdictions, which have a vested interest in protecting the rights of multinational companies. So this information exchange or tax information exchange, which is an international standard, it calls on jurisdictions to obtain information from their financial institutions and automatically exchange that information with other jurisdictions. This common reporting standard can help tax administrations to clamp down on companies that hide or withhold information relating to undeclared offshore funds. Africa has a long way to participate in this system, which is based on reciprocity, and participation in the system is based on full reciprocity. So Africa should also provide information. Most African countries lack the capacity, the infrastructure, and the resources to meet the administrative requirements, particularly on data protection legislation, and bear the costs of, for instance, secure information infrastructure, data collection from all affected financial institutions, of the requirements of participation in the system. Until now, or to date, only 3 African countries are participating in the system. So you can see we have a long way to do that. Meaning out of 54 countries, if you have only 3, it's just a tip of the iceberg. We haven't done almost nothing. So to date, only Mauritius, South Africa, and Seychelles are participating in the system. And only one other country, Ghana, has passed the legislation needed as a first step towards participation. And we hope this will improve. So we need to work a lot on the transparency front if we really want to arrest, reduce, and limit the illicit financial flows from Africa, particularly loan funds that are coming in the form of external debt, with a lot of debt servicing obligations on the principal and the interest rates. Should really be protected. And we don't really see some transparency in the case of disclosing the debts that countries also face. As we were discussing that, we are also confronted with the transparency in terms of tax obligations and also the requirements of international taxation information exchange from the perspective of multinational companies and other countries which are owners of these multinational companies towards Africa. So I hope if these transparency challenges are resolved in the short or medium term, Africa might have a progress in its commitment to reduce illicit financial flows. Okay, that concludes Module 3, and that is also the conclusion of our course. It is relatively extensive, deep, and also very comprehensive course, very much focused in the bold fiscal measures that we need to establish, particularly in tackling debt and debt sustainability challenges, tackling tax and non-tax revenue mobilization challenges, and finally the one that we discussed today, capital flight, particularly illicit financial flows, that is really hurting our continent. And thank you for participating in this course. And if you have any questions, as you know, my email is very clearly laid out in the beginning of our webinars in the last 2 weeks, and feel free to contact me. Otherwise, we will have our last webinar also this week to conclude the course. And thank you for listening.